So now I'm just going to invite Dr. Michael N. DeVito to moderate the next panel.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited for this panel on AI, among other topics. And we're going to start with our next guest speaker, who I'm very happy to introduce. So our next guest speaker is David Nemer, who is an associate professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. David is an ethnographer working at the intersection of science and technology studies, anthropology, ICT for development, and human-computer interaction, with field sites ranging from Latin America to Appalachia, and a knack for illuminating the complex interplay of digital inequality, structural violence, resistance, and appropriation, which defines the use of technologies that can be sources of both oppression and liberation at the same time. His book, Technology of the Oppressed, keeps racking up awards as it influences new work in fields from computer science to communication studies and beyond, and we are very, very glad to have him with us here today. I'll turn it over to David.
Okay, last but not least, let's do this. Let's power through this. We can do it. Last presentation of the day. I promise to go very fast. Try to make this interesting as well. So this is an ongoing work that I've been doing on WhatsApp in Brazil. It started in 2018. This study here actually just got published in a new open access book called Governing Misinformation in Everyday Knowledge Commons. So it was published by Cambridge University Press, open access. Very cool and interesting work being done there. So I highly recommend it. You don't need to read my work. I'll tell you all about it right now. So the basis of this study builds on that in the recent years, major technology companies have taken much of the public blame for the misinformation landscape that we're living in, rightfully so, because their algorithm, as we know, facilitate and even promotes disinformation campaigns. But this misses a key reality. Social media, search engines, messaging apps, AI systems are not fully automated technologies. Rather, they are heteromated, which means that they are reliant on humans to serve their economic goals. Well, I'm sorry about this photo, so let's take a moment to breathe. I'll explain. I didn't expect to have such a large projector here, but we'll go through this. So we know that disinformation and selective news filtering gain attention from scholars and the general public after they contributed to the social media platform ideological polarization that favored Donald Trump and the Brexit vote. However, the rise of Brazil's former president, the far-right firebrand Jair Bolsonaro, owes much to WhatsApp. Who here's on WhatsApp? Okay, so we are on the same page here. Okay. So WhatsApp, the messaging app that runs on peer-to-peer architecture, encrypted messaging, where no algorithm curates content according to the characteristics or demographics of the users. So instead of that, a human infrastructure was assembled to create a pro-Bolsonaro environment on WhatsApp and spread misinformation to bolster his candidacy. So we actually had an organization of people working together to replicate a behavior of an algorithm on WhatsApp. So in this talk, I articulate the labor executed by a human infrastructure of misinformation as heteromated labor. But what is heteromation? What's heteromated? So it was a term coined by Hamid Ekbia and Boninardi, and they claim that there has been a shift from technologies of automation, those which are entirely managed by machines, to those of heteromation, which push critical tasks to the end users as indispensable mediators. So unlike technologies of automation, those of heteromation benefit from or depend on often unrecognized or uncompensated human labor to complete tasks. So they bring a critique to the whole gig work economy, mechanical Turks and all that, because they want to shed light on the precarity of the labor that these platforms impose onto these users. So they examine heteromated systems according to their functionality and reward structure. So they characterize systems in terms of who benefits from the heteromated labor, whether participant compensation is offered, so money, and whether the system produces effective rewards. So they, like I said, they go into Mechanical Turks, focusing on Amazon's MTurk, League of Legends, LOL. There's a lot of work and labor performed by the players, and they're not compensated by money, they're compensated by effect, right? It's the recognition. And a lot of that goes on into the open access and open source software and communities. So, okay, so we're covered on what heteromation means. So how did I get to the Brazilian case? Well, I'm from Brazil, and I'm on WhatsApp. And as you know, every Brazilian, or I guess everybody on WhatsApp, has a family group. And we all know how chaotic that group is. We have, our aunts, our uncles, grandmas, and so on. And they love to send cat memes and good morning memes, good afternoon. So in my extended family group, it's all like, as soon as it hits 9 a.m., it's good morning, good morning, good morning, strawberries, flowers, and so on. And then in the afternoon, it's good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. But in 2018, something changed. Like the tone of the group changed. People were sharing more political content, which it was expected because we were about to hit a presidential election. The campaign was about to start. But instead of sharing links to articles, the mainstream media, which was often the case, they were sharing content that seemed to be created specifically for WhatsApp. And I knew that they weren't creating those contents. I knew that they were not like going to Photoshop or creating memes. I know that wasn't coming from them. So that's when I started to question how were they having access to such content, or who was sending that content to them, and who was producing these media that was somehow promoting Bolsonaro. That's when I decided to investigate this further. And given the prevalence of WhatsApp use and the intriguing way that misinformation was spreading during Brazil's 2018 presidential election, I began monitoring WhatsApp groups that were designed to promote Jair Bolsonaro. And just to give you a sense of how big WhatsApp is in Brazil, 99% of every smartphone in the country is on WhatsApp, and it's used as the main method of communication. So basically, Brazil runs on WhatsApp. So every time there's an outage of WhatsApp, peace comes to the country, and we can move on with our lives. So in March of 2018, I joined 4 pro-Bolsonaro groups through invitation links that were propagated on YouTube videos and also on very conservative forums. I was receiving an average of 1,000 messages per day, so it was a total of 4,000 messages a day. So I had to make meaning and make sense of everything that was going on. I engaged in private conversations with folks that were managing those groups. And instead of focusing too much on the content, on whether or not that was misinformation, I was mostly interested in looking at the social interactions within the group members. So I was observing the users' behaviors, the media sharing practices, patterns of languages and idioms of practice. I wanted to know how and when and why they were doing what they were doing. Because before, the understanding in the country was that, oh yeah, people are just dissatisfied with the government. People are just sharing misinformation organically. And this work, at least in Brazil, was one of the first ones to say, no, there's a whole organization, there's a whole infrastructure put into place to artificially create that sort of commotion, that sort of effect. And after 8 months into analyzing those 4,000 messages a day, I identified 3 key clusters of members and which were behaving in the same way. And I remember this was right before the first round of votes in Brazil. It was around October 2018. I published an op-ed on The Guardian, and it went viral, and people wanted to know more. And this is when, at the time, I thought it was the people working to promote this information was somehow volunteers. But then as I engaged further in this research, I realized that no, there was a lot of money involved. There's a whole infrastructure put into place to make this happen. And so the research evolved to get into this human infrastructure of misinformation that relied on these three groups of people. So at the very base, it's what I call the ordinary Brazilians, which were the vast majority of the members, men and women from all social classes. Bolsonaro at the time was not that popular, even though he won. People wanted to know more about him. And these people had a complete disgust to the mainstream media. So Bolsonaro did a great job in creating this sort of disgust and distrust of the main media. So the people would go to these WhatsApp groups to get what they thought was the real information about Bolsonaro. And every time they would hear something about Bolsonaro, they would go there to confront and make sure that they had the right information. These groups also worked as a repository for their own debates online. So people would go to these groups to download media, to download arguments, to fight on the internet and on Twitter and so on, to make sure that they had the right information. At least they claimed to be the right information to fight those who at the time would vote for Fernando Haddad, which was the Workers' Party nominee. So we had at the base the ordinary Brazilians, and in the middle we had the Bolso army. Originally I called them the Bolsominions, but they're human subjects, so we cannot dehumanize them. So Bolso army is a more respectful way to understand their role here. They were the loyal army that glued the human infrastructure together to actively disseminate disinformation across social media platforms, and also to manage the WhatsApp groups. So they were the admins of WhatsApp groups. They stayed ready to make sure that they were not infiltrators, so they were ready to ban people. If anyone, even with the ordinary Brazilians, if people question the legitimacy of Bolsonaro, they would get kicked out of these groups. So they stood ready to make sure that the environment set in those spaces were very much pro-Bolsonaro. Even people that were pro-Bolsonaro got kicked out for even questioning, because Bolsonaro spent 27 years in Congress and he never passed a bill into law. So people wanted to know his political record, but they saw this as being too threatening, so they would get kicked out. They were the ones that once the misinformation was sent to the groups, they would reinforce the message that they wanted to pass through that media. Because you were not creating the disinformation, they were just reinforcing the message and spreading that disinformation across different social media platforms and also to different groups. It was right at the top, and I call them the influencers, who were creating the disinformation. And I know that they belonged to a very selective WhatsApp group that I didn't have access to, because they would orchestrate and plan what would be the disinformation of the day, of the week. So they could bring that disinformation into these groups that I was monitoring, because they could rely on the Bolsa army to make sure that that message was sent, and then also rely on the ordinary Brazilian to consume that sort of disinformation. So it was almost like a perfect system where you had someone who would produce, those who would share and reinforce the message, and those who would consume disinformation. So this is just an example of the disinformation that they shared during the very first round of votes. In Brazil, they repeatedly circulated fake videos that showed malfunctioning electric voting machines in order to reinforce the idea that the elections were rigged. It's sort of like you guys, I'm sure you're familiar with this whole disinformation about the voting machines not working, which is interesting because he won and he still swears that the machines were hacked and rigged. And anyways, that's not the point here. The other one was, for example, this flyer that circulated very widely, which said that if Haddad would have won, then he would have passed an executive order allowing adults to have sex with minors, with children, which that, stereotypical moral panic promoted by the far right about pedophilia and so on. So now we know who the groups of this human infrastructure of misinformation. So when applying the framework to this, it's easy to see how the human infrastructure of misinformation sustain an information system or a disinformation system on WhatsApp. It worked through the actions of heterogeneous actors. In other words, the members of such infrastructures were users that provided the heteromated labor necessary to make misinformation on WhatsApp work. So the heteromated labor performed by influencers and Bolsa Army was compensated in the amounts of $100 to $250 per week, which is a pretty big amount in Brazil, given that the minimum monthly wage in Brazil is about, at that time, $300 to $400 a month. And they were getting about $100 to $250 a week. Influencers were at the top of this misinformation scheme, as I mentioned, and their cognitive labor comprised of understanding the current and complex political environment in order to promote the presidential candidate Jair Bolsonaro. He was also ready to respond to the criticism that Bolsonaro was receiving during his campaign, so they could produce the media that would debunk or deconstruct those sort of arguments. The Bolsa Army did not engage in heteromated cognitive labor. Instead, they were in charge of repetitive microtasks that followed a predefined script or reacted to a previous trigger. So Bolsa Army also performed communicative labor as they were scripted to reinforce the influencer's content message. As for the average Brazilians, they performed communicative labor as they also helped spread the misinformation post on these pro-Bolsonaro groups. So they would bring that disinformation to their own personal groups, like family groups or church groups or soccer groups and so on. And they also performed what I call here the emotional labor, since they were expected to regulate their emotions during interactions with the Bolsa Army and other average Brazilians. So they feared to being kicked out of those WhatsApp groups. So they often complied with the Bolsa Army's authority and avoided asking questions that could interpret them as challenging Bolsonaro's legacy and feared being kicked out of those groups. So in conclusion, studies on heteromated systems have focused on creating awareness around labor, exploitation, compensation, invisibility, and advocating for labor rights. But in this case, those who comprise the human infrastructure of misinformation, they don't want to be seen, right? Because of the ethical and quasi-legal practices, such awareness might compromise their own businesses, even though they're engaging in labor practices that are a result of the neoliberal practices performed by these platforms. So one of the main arguments that I bring in this chapter is that approaching disinformation as a culture of production expands the field into understanding the social conditions that entice people to this work and the creative industry practices that normalize disinformation as a side gig. The field of disinformation studies has yet to address questions related to the relationship between disinformation and labor, identity and morality, and this is sort of the gap that I hope that my work tries to fill in. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. I'd like to invite 3 other panelists to join us up here for some intro statements, and then we'll have a nice discussion. All right, well, you have decided to sit next to the moderator, so I'm going to invite you to go first.
Hi, I'm John Wibby. I'm an assistant professor, associate professor here. That was a terrific talk. With encrypted applications like WhatsApp, there are just so many questions about who's doing what and where, and that was a really eye-opening and I thought incisive analysis. And I think there needs to be a lot more scholarship, particularly around encrypted apps or the quasi-encrypted apps like Telegram. I guess, I think just analytically, I think it's useful to think about content moderation as having like lots of different kind of subsets of lots of different dimensions. So Robin Kaplan, when she was at Data and Society, had a kind of tripartite way of understanding it, and that was that there's sort of an industrial moderation layer, which is kind of what we conventionally think of when we think of these big moderation teams and the AI classifiers that they deploy. Then there's sort of communal, which is the community doing the moderation, and then artisanal. And artisanal is a little tricky, but like Vimeo or Medium or Discord, where there's some central team, but a lot of it is sort of a case-by-case basis. So I guess I'm interested in solutions to problems like the Bolsonaro army. I've done some amount of thinking about how labeling in particular and contextual information could be part of the solution. And it's in my survey research, I've found that you can, at least in the American context, get a lot of people from both left and right to agree that contextual information labels are a generally acceptable solution. You're not going to get the fringes necessarily to agree to that. But I think there's a lot to be said for content labeling, a lot more transparency, and a lot more commitment on the part of the companies to enable moderators and empower them with tools of various kinds. It's pretty clear that like a WhatsApp doesn't have enough tools, and it's tough because it's an encrypted environment, and so there are lots of trade-offs, right? So if you allow, I forget what the limit is right now with WhatsApp groups, it's like 1,000 people can be part of it. That's probably too many because it gives kind of invisible broadcast power to like a pretty large group. I think at one point it was more like 200. So I think there are questions about how large these like basically invisible groups should be. But I also think that giving moderators more power and more tools to conduct that. And we see some of that with Blue Sky and Reddit nowadays with different kinds of tools, Ozone and whatnot. But I think the companies need to step up and empower sort of good faith actors to do more moderation, but it is very challenging. So I'll stop there. See ya.
So I'm Sina Fazalpur. I'm an assistant professor in philosophy and computer science. Also great presentation, really enjoyed it. I'm also interested in many of the themes that came up, especially around issues about identity and its impact on misinformation detection, as well as some of the issues that come up in relation to solutions. So the type of thing that is currently in my mind with respect to these things, I wanted to motivate it with some of the work that I've done in this domain. So when we use AI in these misinformation detection pipelines or content moderation pipelines, there are many different locations where they could be used. They can provide context, they can retrieve information, they can flag content that is likely to be misinformation and so is in need of fact-checking. They can verify fact-checking results and so on and so forth. So it's important to have a kind of a meaningful framework to evaluate whether these systems are behaving the way that we want them to behave, particularly given the type of values that we have. And the type of things that make this challenging is that obviously this is a multi-stage process, but there are also many different types of stakeholders here involved and many different types of values. So you have people that create the content, they don't want their content to be taken down. You have people that are represented in a particular content, they don't want to be shown in a way that misrepresents them or promotes defamatory or hate speech content about them. You have people that consume the content. You have people that provide evidence that this content is likely to be hate speech, and so you have to take their view into account. So one of the things that we did in this context was drawing on work, including work from Northeastern colleagues such as John and Kay Mathewson and Ron Sandler, to come up with a framework for figuring out these different types of issues about justice with relation to participation, representation, and distributions of different levels of information quality that are involved in misinformation detection systems. So as to be able to kind of map the questions of injustice that arise with respect to different types of AI algorithms that are used here, and come up with empirical measures for assessing the extent to which these type of injustices are there, and provide solutions by identifying the likely sources of this type of harms. So what are the good points of interventions for dealing with them? One of the things that did, so that's the work with Terry Newman and Maria de Ortega at UT Austin. And one of the things that we kind of continue to think about was with respect to one of these particular stakeholders, which we call the sources of evidence. These are human infrastructure of information, kind of misinformation detection systems. These are people such as human labelers, human annotators, whose views shape in content moderation more generally, whether something is seen as toxic, to what extent, whether something is seen as hate speech, whether something is seen as is in need of verification or not. So it is known that the background of these people, their demographics, their political beliefs, their expertise and situated knowledge makes a big difference to the quality of labels that they produce. And so because of that, to the performance and impact of the models that are trained on those labeled data. So for instance, in our work, we show that the identity of this group of human annotators interacts in interesting ways with the design choices that you make when designing, developing an algorithm. For instance, in the context of claim detection, which claims should you allocate more attention to verifying? It turns out that depending on how you operationalize notions such as checkworthiness, how worthy something is of being checked, different groups rate things differently, and their differences in rating might vary depending on their group membership. So positionality of this human infrastructure makes a big difference. Now, a new entity that has entered, and this is the next slide. I'm sorry to. So a new thing that has entered this arena of both misinformation and misinformation detection is generative AI, of course. Some people propose generative AI in use cases that are in some way conventional, that is aligned with the classic, kind of more classic predictive algorithms that we know. So you can fine tune a language model and then use it as hate speech detection algorithm. This raises interesting questions such as how much does fine tuning a model changes its behavior? But then there are other use cases that raise a wholly different type of questions. And these include research where people suggest we can use language models to simulate the behavior of human annotators and human data labelers, especially in the context of tasks such as hate speech detection and content moderation that require this type of positionality. There are a lot of kind of stupid reasons why people want to do this, not very good reasons, so let's not waste our time with them. But there are also some good reasons, such as the cognitive load of dealing with misinformation and harmful content and the psychological toll that it can take on people. So now that people are using it, the question is, how do we evaluate the uses of these systems? And so in some of the works that we've done, both with Terry and with Yuan Gao at Boston University, we have shown that unfortunately, many of the claims about the usefulness of these models, generative AI systems in these capacities is, let's say, I don't want to say unscientific, but not appropriately grounded. So for instance, in the work with Yuan, we showed that when you evaluate the performance of these models on tasks that are less likely to be part of their training data, that is less likely to be memorized by these models, they do not successfully simulate the opinions of human subjects. So this suggests that their success in prior studies might be a result of memorization. In the work with Terry, we showed that there is a serious mismatch between the positionality of these systems when we use a technique called backstory prompting, so which you might have used. Is like, imagine that you're to use myself as an example, and I have to tell my age, but imagine that you're a 40-year-old like Iranian immigrant to whatever country, And now you want to give us your opinion in this thing. What is your opinion, right? This is backstory prompting, and this is supposed to simulate, let's say, an opinion of a person like me. We show that even when you use this type of technique, in many cases, there's a serious mismatch between the positionality of the generative AI output and positionality of human crowdsourced data, such that the generative AI output, in many cases, exaggerates. We look at gender in particular, the gender differences in opinion, even on things that are like banal, such as like, this is an exaggerated example, but this triangle has 3 sides. It says that, oh no, kind of there's a gender difference in this, which is like, there's none. And in many other cases where there is a gender difference, it kind of gets rid of that difference. So you can imagine how this could result in downstream harms. So I suppose the concern here then is that given the importance of identity and given that there's a potential for the use of these systems, how might we end up using them in a way that is scientifically rigorous and not just bad?
Hi. So yeah, this is a very cool panel with and a very cool symposium overall. I'm Derek Curry. I'm an associate professor here at Northeastern, and I do work with Associate Professor Jennifer Godecki back. And I'm here to argue against technological solutions to this type of content moderation. Coming out of the work that Jennifer and I do, which involves an adversarial approach, you could call it red teaming or whatever, we're using LLMs and other types of generative AI like Stable Diffusion to create disinformation to see if it can pass through these content moderation detectors. And it is interesting and easier than you would think, which is somewhat disconcerting to us. We're coming out of research into state-sponsored disinformation campaigns, which involved a type of tactical ethnography, where groups like the Russian IRA would do research into what prompts Americans to take action to respond to certain things happening politically. And what would they do with generative AI and replicating that along with techniques used by companies like Cambridge Analytica that integrate psychographic profiling into the content that they produce. And so we're coming at this from a media archaeology perspective and thinking about the history of art and truth, and an archetype that I always fall back on, which actually comes from Paul Vanus, a bioartist, is that of photography, right? So at the dawn of photography, photographs were considered to be epistemological grounds for truth, right? This is empirical evidence that something happened. The camera was not considered to be anything other than a scientific device. Fast forward 40, 50 years, artists get a hold of this and they start creating photographs of things that couldn't have possibly existed. And so it's no longer evidence, right? It's potentially evidence, but there's this like undermining of it as a type of epistemological measurement. And Paul himself was doing the same thing with DNA. He reconstructed O.J. Simpson's DNA using his own DNA. And so every time there's this a new type of media, a new way of creating media that's been introduced, and you could go back to Plato, there has to be this negotiation that happens with the public as to, you know, what do we do with this? Like, because when information's mediated, it transforms how we know how to deal with it. And so our argument is that not that we shouldn't do content moderation because it's absolutely necessary, but maybe we should focus our efforts more on media literacies, right? Like helping people to understand what this content looks like and how real it could potentially seem. And so like radio and television and other media before generative AI, people are just more skeptical of it. You know, they don't take it at face value.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. So kind of picking up right off that, I'd love to ask a question of all of you. So a lot of talks today, and all of your talks, had an element of the human is actually a huge part of the equation here. We keep talking about AI, but obviously the human remains and is kind of part of the problem sometimes even. If we're going to take an approach that really addresses the human, how do we break past our kind of past failures in doing that, right? We've worked on media literacy in the United States, especially for a very long time, and our approaches thus far haven't really gotten us there. And I'm curious, what do you think we can do to push past that if we're going to take a media literacy approach? And is there a way that the technical tools can maybe help with that as well?
Should I take a step at this? Yeah. Well, the problem is that we've been assigning the wrong people to think about solutions about these problems, right? So like, I don't want to blame computer scientists, but the big tech companies will not come up with solutions to the problems that they are creating or amplifying. And if they are amplifying problems, it means that these problems pre-exist their existence, that is rooted in deeper social issues that go beyond technology. So when we come to misinformation, we cannot think about a silver bullet to solve this problem. It is a multifaceted phenomenon that requires several approaches to deal with this. So just here on this panel, we converged with our criticism, but at the same time, we're providing different approaches to face this phenomenon of misinformation. So yes, fact-checking is important, of course. Moderation, yes. But the way that I see this is that we should act before misinformation is brought into the center of the public debate. I hate when I talk about marine research and people are like, oh yeah, misinformation has always existed. Yeah, sure, but not the way that exists now. Misinformation has always existed at the periphery of the public debate. Now, what these human infrastructure misinformation and algorithms are doing is to bring that into the center and occupying the space where we could have been having more productive and progressive debates, but now we're talking about whether or not vaccines are good for us or not, So I think having a multifaceted approach to this phenomenon, which would include, computer scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, everybody, to together tackle this, I think it's one of the best ways to do this.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems is just the scale that we have with the technological infrastructure we're currently using for communication. Social media and other online platforms, where if you wanted to reach the public 100 years ago, there were certain gatekeepers that would prevent you from doing that. Now that we've given everyone a voice, which seemed like a good idea before we did it, we realized that great ideas can now reach everyone, but so can stupidity and bad ideas and harmful ideas. And there's so much information being produced, a lot of it by people who have no business producing it, that the media landscape is just flooded with all types of information, correct information, misinformation, and everything in between. But it's really unpopular to suggest that maybe we just shouldn't let people have access to tools that allow them to reach 3/4 of the planet. And I don't know what to do about that.
I also want to kind of, obviously, it's multifaceted. I want to echo that point that whatever we do, we have to, it cannot just be media literacy, because people are bombarded with information, even if they're extremely literate. If 99% of what they get is garbage, they get tired. And we all have that WhatsApp group that we don't even check because there's a family member that just forwards everything. But to go back to that kind of human element, I think one of the lessons learned, or lessons that we are still learning or should learn, is acknowledge the human element, particularly in the technological design. I think even as we talk, even though, so as I said, and it should not come as a surprise, who you ask about what counts as toxic speech or hate speech or kind of suspicious information is going to make a big difference on the type of models that then you're going to train on and the type of classification that you're going to get, right? But even as we talk, even as some people have shown this, like including me in different ways, and even as some people have kind of made proposals about it, most data sets do not provide any information about whose view is, like, who are the annotators, or like what is their kind of positionality, what is their demographic information. We don't know anything about that. In many cases, we don't even have annotator level data. In some cases, actually the vast majority of cases, when there's disagreements between human annotators about what the label for a particular kind of informational item should be, there's people just do majority voting. And we know as a result of that, in many cases, the resulting algorithms kind of exacerbate harms, particularly against marginalized communities. So I think one element is just acknowledging that human factor and just not pushing it under the rug. And it kind of goes back to this idea of acknowledging the kind of this invisible labor that goes in there.
So I struggle with a lot of these questions because sometimes we really do focus on the kind of tail harms and forget that, like, the vast majority of human speech on digital platforms is either benign or pro-social. So we should be very careful to say that most of the empirical literature suggests that the people who are originating really harmful disinformation, incitement, hate speech, and whatnot are relatively small. And so when we focus our attention to those groups that are doing that, we have to think about what are the tools that we could use. And I actually think we just need a lot more transparency on these platforms. And so what the Europeans have done with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, I think, is maybe imperfect for the American system, but I'm kind of advancing this argument that we should set up a new digital agency, that it should have some regulatory power. It should track roughly to what we did in 1934, which is to set up the FCC. The FCC was based on very broad general principles, and then over time we had rulemaking. And I think we have to get to that point. And I know it's not going to probably happen under the Trump administration, but like, this is a long journey. I think of it as a 100-year journey. And I think we need to focus on these disparate harms that affect, often marginalized groups that are often advanced by very small bad actors. And we have to figure out how to create transparency around that, and then to propose a variety of solutions. And I actually think AI can be helpful. There are many people in the industry, and I talk with a lot of the companies and the platform companies, and have consulted for them some. And they're convinced that generative AI can be a very important tool. If they withdrew all of their AI classifiers today, there would be literally hundreds of millions of instances of hate speech, child sexual abuse material, incitement that would just flood all these platforms. So the AI classifiers are important. The generative AI that's being deployed can help, but clearly, a lot of stuff still, gets through. And we have to, I think, seriously figure out how we can bring transparency to that kind of content, bring it into the public light, and start a public conversation, a process about how we're going to deal with this problem of as Derek said, it's just a massive, it's a problem of massive scale. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Let's open it up to some questions from the audience. I think we've got someone on the microphone. Let me go over here first.
Hi, thank you for your perspectives. I have a question for David. Do you think that the model that you saw with WhatsApp in Brazil was something, or did you see any evidence if it was imported from somewhere else, like other groups in other countries, like doing the same kind of like organized campaign through other, not WhatsApp, but Signal or other applications? And I also have a second question, like how, if you could speak, how did you get to how much people are being paid to do this work, and how did you get to figure that out? Thank you.
Thank you. To your first question, no. So again, this is an online ethnographer, so it's very much nuanced into the Brazilian context and culture. But I've had folks reading that paper, that article, and be like, yeah, I've seen this in the Philippines. I've seen this in India. So I'm happy to see that there is a correlation and unfortunately a model that works in other cultures, especially those that are reliant so much on these messaging apps. I haven't heard anything about similar things here in the United States just because WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal now has been used by our government, but not the common American. So I haven't heard anyone making those comparisons, but certainly in different cultures, but I haven't identified that. For your second question, so I did talk to people in private chats. So they would come and let me know, and they even like shared a table of how much they would get paid for which kind of media, which kind of content, for how many groups they would manage. So that was all like very well stipulated.
Let's take another one.
Sure. I actually have two questions, but I'm going to not be greedy, so I'll ask the more controversial one, I guess. Several of you were talking about the different ways that the annotators or coders function in this process, and none of you really addressed the exploitation that's going on in the process. So I'm thinking of, for example, last summer, the Kenyan annotators who petitioned President Biden and whatnot. I'm curious if how we account for models of this need for sort of a subjective view to sort of even mitigate some of the problems of AI, how we account for exploitation in our models of sort of testing when that seems to be a consistent problem across platform.
Briefly, I mean, I think I alluded to it at the end that like the first stage, of course, is to acknowledging this human infrastructure, which is like in this case that we were talking about was a misinformation detection and content moderation. But as you say, it's all over. Whenever there's an AI, it's likely to be something like, I don't want to say mechanical Turk in the kind of the old ways, but there's always like lots of exploited human labor in reinforcement learning from human feedback, all types of red teaming and so on and so forth. And I think there are good proposals out there about how we might go about doing something by seeing these people as maybe kind of more explicitly as part of the development team that is part of the corporations that develop these models, as opposed to just like outsourced labor or at best some type of consultant that comes and gives a one-off consultation. To what extent those proposals can be turned into reality in a context where there's no incentive that could come from different ways, that's another question.
I mean, part of it is, I mean, there are sort of ready-made principles under the UN, for example, on business and human rights, or the Ruggie principles, you know, which have a normative view of like what global corporations should do, and that means doing risk assessments, paying living wages, monitoring, reporting, and so, I mean, frankly, we need international bodies plus a State Department that's going to help us, enforce some of that and create norms. And so I think that's really important. I mean, the companies will say that generative AI is potentially helping to shield the kind of the frontline labelers and moderators from having to do some of the really extreme labor. Like they're just really awful. Like seeing, horrific, violent images all day long is not good for the human psyche. We know that. And so, a combination, I think, of some of the tools, plus I think better labor standards and more scrutiny, I think could create better situations. The one thing you wouldn't want to see is, people just lose their jobs altogether because there's pressure, because the companies just want to whitewash their reputation. So they just pull out of all of these things. I think the ideal would be to employ lots of people around the world in a humane way to help the models and to help, the policy leaders at like a lot of the platform companies, like do their job well, but do it in a really humane way at a living wage, and to really elevate that profession of content moderation. The trust and safety profession, which is like much maligned right now, needs to really be resuscitated. And I think that's, having a global community that identifies as trust and safety professionals who can make a living that way, where there's a career ladder. You're not just like some, cog in a content review farm wheel. I think that's the way to go. And but that's just my view.
So how do you bring some of these trust and safety activities and increasing the human dimension of this whole process when the incentives of these companies are diametrically opposed to trust and safety in many respects? And now you have an administration that wants to make sure that one particular group of people has free speech and another group of people has constrained speech.
That's a good question, right? This is where I get very skeptical of creating new. I always think of it as a ministry of truth, and that's maybe a little bit pejorative. But I mean, if you create some sort of agency to oversee what is and isn't truth, it's going to change and be staffed by different people every time we get a different administration, and that to me is potentially problematic. See, I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
Well, to add to that, like, this is the challenge of doing this kind of research, right? Because we're researching these platforms, these apps, that whoever is behind developing them, they're not interested in solving these problems. It goes against their financial model. Like once I was talking to Loris Lessig, and he was saying that, David, there's nothing really wrong with social media. The problem is the financial market behind it, which is basically, what has come down to these online platforms. So I think that's the biggest problem. Like we can stay here researching, critiquing, maybe providing solutions, interventions, but when, the main people that could actually make a difference don't want to do it, then that becomes very hard, especially now given the current political environment. This is why now we're seeing statements like Zuckerberg's statements a couple of months ago saying that he's going to get rid of all the moderation offices, and he built a platform trying to make it such a global presence, saying that he was a global community, to say that now it's an American company with American values. So how do you fight that? Like how, especially if you're a foreigner, what do you say? There's nothing. They became too powerful. That's why I believe that only the state has the power to tame them through regulations, but now the government doesn't want to do it. So we're screwed. I mean, that's the end where.
I think we have to remember that everything is a political process, right? There's going to be no, like my proposal for like a digital agency, which is not mine alone. I mean, there are lots of people out there who have different ideas around this. The idea is to set up a process, a political process, where we can discuss these things publicly. It's not just grandstanding before Congress, right? That we put serious political pressure on the platforms, that yes, it's going to have lots of politics and it's going to be messy, but that's what the FCC was, right? When we started in 1934, when we created the fairness doctrine, right? When we had what the broadcasters all said was like the spirit of responsible broadcasting. It lasted for about 30 years. in the last century, and they weren't pulling licenses, and they weren't trying to decide like what's true and what's not true, but they put political pressure on the media companies to actually think about before they put something on air. Does this have, are both sides represented? Is this dangerous? And I actually think you could regulate from the perspective of systemic risk. And so that means you don't have a sort of nanny state where it's like, oh, there's one piece of disinformation, we're shutting you down. It's rather, is there systematic patterns of harm? That could be to children, it could be disparate harm to disadvantaged groups, it could be financial, a whole bunch of different ways we could characterize it. And Europe is actively defining this. And we could have a political process where we keep working through these questions. We're in the era of probability. Most content, there's like no right answer, right? Sometimes it's very black and white, but a lot of times it's not. And I think we're naive to think that like put it this way, this is not a problem to be solved, it's a problem to be managed. And so what I'm advocating is put infrastructure, public infrastructure in place so that you can manage the problem over time. And it may take 20 or 30 years, but remember, like broadcast regulation started in some ways when the Titanic sunk and 1 million people with shortwave radio started talking about it and spread misinformation. That created the Radio Act of 1912. It took 20 more years to get to the FCC. It took a long time to 49 to get to the Fairness Doctrine. Like we have to start thinking in ways that are solutions oriented.
I just want to say something. I mean, obviously, when there's misaligned incentives, we have regulation. We don't in this case. And so it's going to be difficult. But I want to just qualify what you said a little bit. I don't think that companies are opposed to everything trust and safety. I want to, in fact, make the case that, so I work in responsible AI, the field that changes its name every other day because of different things, AI safety, trustworthy AI, algorithmic fairness, whatever. I work in that field, and I want to make the claim that if that field did not exist, a company like OpenAI would not have existed to this extent. Partly because the content, why is it that everybody uses these models? Is because the content that you get is not toxic and garbage, and it's the content, at least on the surface, obviously you can find cases that are horrible. So what I'm suggesting is that if that research, that line of research did not exist, if that company had not actually, maybe you can critique it that it did it in a very superficial way, and it's kind of very plausible. But if that company did not take that into account, its product will not have any uptake, I think, socially. If everybody could just use DALL-E to generate, let's say, very, very problematic content that systematically harms children, let's say, I don't think this company would have been at all where it is now. So I think there is maybe it sounds like a sad business case, but there is a business case to be made for this type of work. And I think many companies care about that. And so maybe the hope is to, and one could say the same thing about misinformation. Many companies care about AI-generated images, partly because they want to train their models on synthetic data, blah, 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 blah. This doesn't mean that there's no misaligned incentives, but I also want to say that the incentives cannot be completely opposed either.
I'm thinking of something else as we're talking about this, and just when you try to implement something like this, there's always this question of like, what do you allow and what don't you allow? And there's different sorts of consensus building processes for this. And I think of a project that came out of the Media Lab a few years ago called Moral Machine, which was sort of a reconfiguration of an old moral conundrum where you have a car and you have to decide, there's people crossing the road when they shouldn't be. Do you hit them or do you crash the car and kill the people in the car? And interesting thought experiment. What they did with this was they collected data from various parts of the world to see what was acceptable. And they found that in some countries, it was acceptable to kill women and not men. It was acceptable to kill older people, or, like what would be tolerated. And when I think of disinformation, everybody wants disinformation. Well, most people want disinformation to be suppressed. But when we talk about what this actually is, it becomes a little bit more tricky, right? And so if you think about something like the Moral Machine, and you applied that to, say, the antebellum South in the United States and said, should you be allowed to own other people? What do you think the majority of people would say? Or you could do the same thought experiment in Berlin in 1930 and ask them how they felt about dispossessing certain groups of people and maybe killing them. You know, the devil's in the details. And when we're talking about what people think and what they're okay with, we're talking about everyone, and that becomes really difficult to manage.
I'm gonna just shift a little bit because I wanted to talk about something actually game related. So right around the time of the first Trump administration, there was an article in the Guardian about Gamergate, and it described Gamergate as the canary in the coal mine of the alt-right. And kind of my take on this as someone who is very, like, I basically personally know everybody that was targeted by Gamergate. What I kind of feel like is that the human infrastructure problem is a bigger problem. It has to do with a kind of, and I just got back from Scandinavia, by the way, so I'm really aware of this, that America has a super high tolerance for shitty speech. And a few people have been circulating on Facebook a little thing about the paradox of tolerance. And I feel like part of the problem here is that we think free speech applies to any bullshit that anybody says, any hate speech, any lie. And I think this is a bigger problem than either the human infrastructure or the AI, and that this is a societal issue that we now tolerate any nonsense that anybody wants to spew out. And I'm just wondering if there's, and I appreciate the conversations about the history of regulation and the FCC and all that. I come from the period where all the news channels would report more or less the same thing. A long ago era in the 1900s or whatever that no longer exists. So I just was wondering if you could comment a little bit about this kind of larger cultural issue of just the fact that Americans will just put up with any nonsense that anybody wants to spew out.
Yeah, I don't know why we put up with it, but I think part of the problem is something you mentioned earlier. I mean, it's like it's existing because of a capitalistic system which allows for platforms to compete for customers, and if you have a large enough group of people that wants to say a bunch of terrible shit, and you have a platform that will let them do it, and other platforms won't, you know, it becomes a race to the bottom. We've seen similar things, like for example, like rights of corporations. You know, Delaware's, you know, grants corporate personhood and it gets rid of certain obligations, and all the companies move to Delaware. So other states follow suit. You know, it's a similar process that I think makes it difficult to put onto the platforms themselves when they're for profit and they're all allowed to do it. And I don't know, but I still don't have I don't have any good ideas for how to approach it.
I can say something, if that's okay. So to go beyond platforms and looking at this issue in a broader sense, I think there's a degradation to the social fabric and the welfare state, basically, which is pushing these people to perform in these human infrastructures of misinformation because they need the money. But so now they are for, you know, free speech just so they can make money. I come from a country, Brazil, that has criminalized homophobic and racist speeches. Like, you can't say these things. You go to court, you go to jail, actually. There's no bail, actually. And these people now are going against, and this is the thing, like, that in Brazil has always been agreed on. Like, Brazilians have agreed on our own cultural and social understandings of free speech in the country. Since these platforms became so prevalent in Brazil, this whole understanding of free speech has been, you know, twisted. And it's just another colonizing ways of promoting, big tech ideology or, I don't know, American ideology because they say, the First Amendment. We also know that the First Amendment is regulated, right? Obscene speech is not protected, for example. But now because there's people want to make money because, we live in this neoliberal state that doesn't provide anything to those who need the most, who lives under precarity. So they are finding ways to get money. I have a perfect anecdote from, it's a quote from one of my informants. He said that, I asked him, like, don't you know that this is disinformation? Don't you know that this is harmful? He's like, well, if you go to McDonald's, everyone knows there that the food is terrible. It's going to cause you cancer and so on. But they're still selling it because they have to pay the bills. The same thing here. I know that this information is not healthy, but I need the money. I need to pay my bills.
I mean, I think in the legal academy, and I've been reading some of that literature, I mean, they're talking a lot about how the quote unquote free speech consensus has broken down. So for a long time, I mean, I'm sure you well know, there was a kind of an alignment between the civil libertarians like the ACLU and often people on the left and the free speech fundamentalists often on the right. And that was a vision America really tried to export around the world. I mean, and the platforms have facilitated that. But I think whether it's the cases before the Supreme Court or like what you would see the vice president currently saying, like it's clear that this is breaking down. And that's something new and novel in American politics and policy. We don't know where this is all going, but the fact that people on the left and the right are now saying very different, where they used to totally agree. People are starting to nuance this. They're starting to say, frankly, like pretty hypocritical things, I think, on the right. And I don't know how this is all going to shake back out. And I think we're in this like transitory moment where, and I think this is Lee Bollinger, who was the president of Columbia, in a First Amendment scholar, said that I heard him talk about the real difference is that when bad things happened, for example, the Ku Klux Klan marching through a town out in Ohio, that the national leaders would condemn that. And so what's happened now, but we allowed it to happen under free speech principles in the First Amendment, which I mostly support. But then you would have broad condemnation. And so what's changed is that we're not getting the broad condemnation. And so now we're stuck with the bad stuff without a real consensus around around how it should be perceived morally in the world of norms.
To add to that, it happened in Charlottesville at UVA, my home institution, and then instead of having the condemnation, we had Trump saying great people on both sides. That's exactly it.
Can I ask one last question? Are we wrapping up? Oh, we've got time. Excellent. Wonderful. So I'll state the question first because I'm going to do the academic thing and give the background to the question as well. And my question is basically, what lessons have you learned in your research from people in vulnerable positions that we should amplify as we're coming up with these corrective measures and with these strategies to address misinformation in our current systems? And I asked that question because there were a couple of statements from the panel early on that, as an academic, disagreeing with my colleagues, I disagreed with. So the first one, that misinformation is a new problem and hasn't always been central to the United States, specifically from a journalistic perspective. I look at eras of yellow journalism and eras of journalism in which whole groups of people were made out to be brutes and savages, and that was misinformation. It's not presentism to say that those narratives were not misinformation. The other part of that is thinking about the idea that perhaps not everyone should have access to social media tools or to digital tools because the speech that comes from everywhere may not always be pro-social. Mark Zuckerberg, in his desire to connect the world, he's a powerful person and didn't think about what mob violence can look like and how it is told through stories, like how it's incited through stories, right? But if he spoke to people who understood how powerful storytelling is, even in a small village, he might think about what it means to connect millions of people across the globe on a singular platform. So I'm going to come back to the question with those things in mind. What lessons have you learned from people in vulnerable positions in your research that we should amplify as we think about updating and changing our systems to combat misinformation?
Hello. That's a great question, and I love how you contextualize that, Meredith. Thank you so much. Well, from my research, and this is something that I mentioned in the previous question, the people are engaging in this human infrastructure of misinformation because somehow, and I'll say this in broad terms, but I'll get to the details, somehow the system has failed them. So like they can't afford to work 2 shifts because they have to take care of their family, they have to take care of kids, there's no like public schooling where they're at. So they have to find a way to make money to make ends meet. And it is precisely because the state has taken a step back to allow these companies and other companies to take care of the people, and these companies do not have people in their best interest, then we see the result of human infrastructure misinformation taking place. And these people are, in vulnerable positions and living under precarity that, again, has to engage in practices that they know is somewhat wrong, but yet they need to fulfill a greater goal, which is basically to pay their bills. There is an ideological component to their motivations, but there's also this financial component that in my research, I understood as being the loudest one. So again, as Celia said, there's a broader problem here, which is, again, the void that the state has opened for other people, for other companies to take care of the people, and they're not doing this because it's not in their best interest. We need, again, to have more civic spaces. We need to have more incentives coming from even the state, so they are not pushed to these liminal spaces, and they have to engage in these practices.
Yeah, so a specific example that Jennifer and I work from quite often in our argument for media literacies is coming out of the Mueller investigation and looking into the disinformation campaigns over Twitter and Facebook. There are several accounts, more than several, but initially several accounts were revealed to be Russian sock puppet operatives. And one of those operatives was a very active member in the community of Black Twitter. Once the identity of that Russian sock puppet operative was revealed, other members of that community correctly identified over a dozen other sock puppets, correctly identified. And so we started to look into, this is a strategy, and we found that other people had done academic studies around the idea of inoculation theory, where if you expose people to disinformation or fake news, fake photos, it'll help them become more skeptical. And I think in that way, the mistakes that are made by generative AI right now are going to be very valuable, right? Like like there's too many fingers on a hand or an extra leg or something like that. Those problems will eventually be solved, but it gets people to start trying to notice things like that. So when it becomes a little bit more nuanced, maybe they'll have the cognitive tools to be skeptical of that.
Just to bring it back to sort of David's excellent opening remarks. I mean, one of the big questions for the planet right now is what we do about encrypted messaging applications. I do think it's like because a lot of the incitement, hate speech, disinformation is there. It's not on the public socials that we're all thinking about. It's in these. And so one idea, and James Grimmelman at Cornell wrote a paper about this, and I was sort of doing some research. There's this idea of message franking. So this may be surprising to you, but if you wanted to report the Bolsonaro weirdo army people, and you could get Mark Zuckerberg on the phone. One problem Mark has is he actually doesn't have any visibility into the community because it's encrypted. But one technical possible solution is that you put a piece of code on the message, and if the recipient, who's a valid part of that group, wants to then report that up, then Meta or whatever encrypted messaging platform you're using, Signal, could potentially at least validate that message existed in that group, which is the start of some kind of actual enforcement and content moderation. The other thing is, I actually asked some of our cybersecurity experts here, like, is it possible to get to within the encrypted flow of bits? Can you insert classifiers at all without breaking encryption? And that's actually an unclear question. So I think there's actually a bunch of technical stuff that could help with some of this. David, I don't know how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, so WhatsApp was actually trying a beta system that you could unpack the encrypted message and report to them, and they would have access to the metadata with unique identification, and they could trace where other groups and numbers that message traveled to and take them down without opening those ones. I mean, this is why, like, when you get messages that were forwarded too many times, you get that label forwarded because they are able to identify that message.
Right. And this is where the encryption community is like at loggerheads too, because they're maximalist people and then they're traditional people. And then people are saying, no, like franking actually could be a way of splitting the difference. You don't break encryption, but you allow for some kind of enforcement if there's like horrible hate speech and disinformation flowing through. So, I mean, Meredith, to answer your question, like maybe there are some technical things that could be introduced that could help, especially where groups are just being attacked, because that has happened over and over again, as you know.
All right. Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much to the panelists and to David for his talk. Thank you all for being here.
So now it's the moment everybody's been waiting for. We're going to have a drum performance, but we're just going to have a 10-minute break so we can set up here.